Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chair and members. My name is Helen Kirstein with the Legislative Analyst's Office. And like the previous speakers, I want to thank you very much for providing us with the opportunity to discuss this issue with you today. Our office, like the other speakers, really believes infrastructure is a very important statewide issue. And we're really pleased that the administration has put forward this plan, which gives us a good opportunity to discuss the issue with you. So before I start, I want to mention that our office recently released a report that reviews the plan, and I'll just highlight some of the items that we discuss in the report, but you should have that, and I'll reference it briefly in my remarks. So in my comments, I'll focus on really three main issues. First, I'll start by talking about some of the things that we think are really big merits of the plan, and I'll focus on three major policy issues that the plan brings up that we think are really key issues for the legislature to think about. I think they've largely been touched on before, but I'll highlight them again. And then I'll mention a few places, secondly, where we think there's some areas that we could build on what's in the plan and make it even a more useful document potentially for the legislature going forward. Finally, I'll just suggest some ways the legislature may wish to consider engaging the issue of infrastructure going forward, recognizing its key importance to the state. So first, I just want to go over the three main policy issues that we saw brought up in the plan that we think are really critical. The first one is the state versus local roles in funding some types of infrastructure. The second one, which we heard a little bit about as well, is the state's reliance on bond funding, on debt to finance its infrastructure. And the third one is the backlog of deferred maintenance that's been building up in the state. So first, with regard to state versus local responsibilities, we think this is a really important issue for the legislature to think about. So historically, the state has actually spent a lot of its infrastructure dollars on basically local infrastructure. In fact, in the last decade, about half, or actually more than half, of the state's infrastructure dollars have been administered by local agencies. So we're spending a lot of money on local infrastructure. This isn't a good or bad thing necessarily, but it's definitely something we should be thinking about the ongoing state role. And in the plan, the governor actually brings up two specific areas where he's proposing a conversation about the state's continued role. And the Department of Finance touched on those. K through 12 education and community colleges are the two areas he's proposing having that conversation. So we think that's a really valuable conversation for the legislature to have and a really important policy issue. We also just want to note that there are some other policy areas, some other areas of infrastructure spending where the state does fund quite a large share or put quite a lot of infrastructure dollars towards local projects. So things like local streets and roads we invest very heavily in, local jails, parks to some extent that serve local needs. So there are other areas the legislature may also want to think about its ongoing role in funding infrastructure versus what locals can take on. So the second major policy issue that I wanted to highlight that the plan brings up and we think is really important is the state's reliance on bond funding. So as was noted, the plan brings up the state's increased reliance on bonds and on debt to fund its infrastructure. There certainly is a role for bonds, we think. A lot of infrastructure provides a useful life of many years. So there's certainly an appropriateness in some cases for funding it over a longer period of time. But we also note that it's a challenging thing because we're committing dollars that we could spend on programs towards infrastructure, and we're making those commitments for a long period of time. So our office doesn't believe there's a right level of debt service or a right amount of infrastructure spending. That's really a policy call. But we think it's a very important conversation to think about and an important issue for the legislature to grapple with. What is its comfort level with taking on additional debt? So finally, in terms of policy issues, I wanted to mention the deferred maintenance issue. So we think this is a really important contribution to the plan. Past plans have not included a discussion of deferred maintenance. As the previous speakers discussed, deferred maintenance is a huge issue for the state. We have a lot of aging infrastructure in the state. And a lot of it, we've deferred the kinds of routine and preventive kinds of activities to some degree that we should have been doing. So we've developed a backlog, and it can, as was described, it can create future costs that are even higher. So we think it's a really important issue, and we're really pleased that the administration has made an attempt to quantify it and also has proposed some steps towards starting to address that issue. There are just a couple things I'd mention that we may want to think about, the legislature may want to consider as it's thinking about the administration's proposal. I think one of which is the amount of the proposal, and as was indicated, this is really a first step. So the proposal is only proposing to spend less than 2% of the identified need. So it's an important first step, but there's certainly a long way to go. And one of the things we think the legislature may want to think about is, whether the administration, maybe perhaps asking the administration if they have a longer-term plan for addressing the remainder of the infrastructure needs or the deferred maintenance needs. So a second thing with regard to deferred maintenance that may merit consideration is the distribution between and among the different departments. So on page 5 actually of our report, we provide a little table that shows the amount that's proposed for each department in terms of deferred maintenance dollars, the identified need, and then the percentage of the identified need that's funded. And you'll notice that there's a wide variation in the percentage of identified need that's funded. We don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. There may be more severe needs in certain areas than others, but we do think that it's something that merits some consideration and perhaps a little bit more investigation as to what led the administration to propose these levels of spending and whether that's consistent with the legislature's priorities. So one final note with regard to deferred maintenance is that this is really a one-time kind of proposal. It's a one-year proposal, and really there's an ongoing issue that's creating deferred maintenance. So on an ongoing basis, the state isn't investing in its maintenance the way it would need to prevent the accumulation of additional deferred maintenance. So even if we could come up with the full, $65 billion this year, which is unrealistic, I think, but even if we could do that, further deferred maintenance would continue to develop unless we get at that underlying issue. So one of the things we propose is asking some of the departments as they present their plans what led to their deferred maintenance issues, and that way once we identify the causes, we can start thinking about ways to try to get at that issue and potentially have plans for moving forward and trying to address this. And so that we don't actually have every year a deferred maintenance proposal, but we get rid of deferred maintenance as much as we can. That should be our ultimate goal. So we think, and we actually propose in our recent Resources and Environmental Protection report, we propose we could, for example, have a pilot or a test case, and we propose the Department of Parks and Recreation could be an example of a department we choose to just try to get at how can we create a plan so that we can really tackle this issue. That's a department that's had some long-standing challenges with deferred maintenance. So as I mentioned, those are the three major policy issues that we think were addressed in the plan that we think are really important issues. We also note that there are some areas where we think the plan could be augmented, and we think we could build on it and make perhaps an even more helpful plan. So we'll note there are a couple areas where we think that there could have been additional information provided, and in some cases that we think that the statute suggests that more information should have been provided. So a couple areas. One is past plans provided a full list of capital projects identified by departments. This year's plan doesn't do that. And we think that's really valuable because it can provide a little bit more of a sense for the legislature of what the full capital needs are. Also, there's limited information on some areas of education, and I think the administration has touched on its take on administration a little bit, but we do think that there's value in having an identification of the needs in the education arena and proposed projects in that arena as well. So also, we think that there are some areas that, while not required, could be augmented perhaps to provide a little bit more information to the legislature. I'll just mention one briefly. As I noted earlier, the state spends a lot of money on local infrastructure. And the plan as it's currently constructed really doesn't include most types of local infrastructure. And so we think that that's one thing that means that one reason why it's really hard to tell from the plan the full scope of the state's investments in infrastructure. You really see what the state largely is spending on state infrastructure and to some limited degree local infrastructure. So we think that's one area we could potentially work on augmenting the plan, and we'd be very happy to work with the administration on ways we could tweak the plan to make it more helpful to the legislature going forward. So just finally, I just want to mention legislative engagement. We think this is a really important issue, as I said before. We're really pleased to be here and pleased about this, this committee hearing. We think it's a great way to start tackling this issue. But it is a hard issue. It's an issue that's very cross-cutting. It involves a lot of money over a long period of time. And so we think that there's a continued role for the legislature in really focusing on this. And we mentioned in our report one possible thing the legislature could consider, which is infrastructure committees or a committee that would focus on this issue on an ongoing basis. That's one way the legislature could look at the issue. There are certainly many others, but we're glad that this hearing, I think, is a great first start, and we're very pleased to be here. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Kirstein. Does Mr. Brown have anything to add? You're here as a support. Great, great. Thank you. Thank you. Members, Mr. Wagner.
Thank you. Ms. Kirsten asked a great question, and I think I want to follow up on it and see if we can get an answer. We heard that this is a modest amount from the first panel, and I think Ms. Kirsten's question was, how did the administration go about even coming up with this number? And so I guess I'd like to see if there is an answer to that question, and the follow-up would be, and once we know what the number is, how do we know that the allocation amongst the different needs is the right way to go? How did you go about evaluating? Is it the locals that scream the loudest? Is it the problems that have gone on the longest? Is it where the most jobs are? How did you go about making the allocation?
Sure. There's actually a lot that goes into making a decision like this, and I think it's important, though, to keep in context that you know, our needs are so much greater than the $815 million that we, when we looked at the overall budget, thought was a amount that we could dedicate to this purpose. Because I think the overall state budget situation really is also driving these decisions. And I think from our view, you know, many of the upticks in the revenues that we're seeing are really fleeting because they're related to capital gains, and so we don't want to be in a situation of committing ongoing or one-time monies to ongoing resources. So that's where actually maintenance came in, even though I think the LAO's point, and we agree that maintenance is really an ongoing need. But it is something that can be easily turned on and turned off if revenues really do fall out next year. And so that's different from hiring a lot of staff that is much more difficult to turn on and off. So first of all, I think, you know, there was one-time monies and available. And I'll go through the list because some of them, I think, you know, there's probably a little less analysis. Some of it has to do with the HUDA, the Highway User Tax Account loan repayment. That was a loan repayment, so that's $337 million that the state's general fund had borrowed during difficult fiscal times to help the state's general fund. That money has been made available from the general funds. We're repaying that loan. So that number is not a magic number. It was a number that that was a loan that we saw on our list of loans that we were continuing to chip away and pay down year after year that we could make available for the important issue of highway maintenance. The 188 for the emergency repair program is funding within the Proposition 98 guarantee. I'm not going to go into all of the machinations of Proposition 98 funding, but in every year there are some one-time resources, and this was an amount that was dedicated to that, to maintenance. Also satisfying a lawsuit, an ongoing lawsuit that we've been dealing with for quite some time.
Keeley, will that number have to be repeated in future years? Is that going to be an ongoing commitment because of the lawsuit?
I would probably have my education expert come up on that, the Williams lawsuit. So, Ian Johnson.
Ian Johnson, Department of Finance. So the Williams settlement, which was settled in 2004, created the emergency repair program. Basically, that program will continue until a total of $800 million has been provided. This program provides deferred maintenance funding to address kind of the most critical health and safety issues at school districts. To date, $338 million has been provided for that purpose. Okay. So our $188 million would add to that total, and the program would continue until a total of $800 million was provided.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you. Go ahead, Keeley.
Yeah, and then we start to get into, the parks and corrections and DDS. I'm going to set aside the judicial branch because, again, the judicial branch, the $15 million there is a dedicated special fund source. That's money that was available on a one-time basis for maintenance. But in terms of the general fund deferred maintenance, clearly there are needs that are well beyond what's been allocated here in all of these programs. But some of the inputs that went into our decision process had to do with ability to get the projects done. Each of these departments is dealing with a capacity of staff and resources internally. So I think, in many cases, looking at what was possible. Also looking at some of the most critical health and safety issues, corrections, the DDS, the state hospital. These are all facilities where people live. There's significant health and safety issues related that have popped up from time to time and even have required emergency allocations in some years. So these are areas where we want to make sure we're on top of really critical deferred maintenance. When we talk about the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, we have been under significant scrutiny from the federal courts about a constitutional level of health care. Many of their complaints have been related to facilities. So there are monies there to address some of those issues. And there are some departments that are not on this list, and that's because some of those departments have been supported by special funds, and during the fiscal crisis have been more insulated, I would say, not completely insulated from the impacts of the fiscal crisis, but have had a more steady investments in maintenance, and they're not on this list. So some of those, I would say, would be like CHP is one example that comes to mind. So they've had less, many of these departments eliminated deferred maintenance budgets during tough fiscal times to address general fund cut targets. So some of this is really putting money back where it was taken from during the crisis time.
Mr. Wagner.
Does that answer the LAO's question, and is that a fair methodology? Are you comfortable with that? Do you still have questions about it?
So I think that's excuse me. I do think that's certainly a reasonable methodology, and I think the legislature it is a policy call ultimately for the legislature how it wants to prioritize that spending. But certainly the administration has a reasonable approach that they've articulated. So it comes down to thinking about, and it's a little challenging because we don't have a lot of detail on all of these proposals, but just thinking about whether there are certain things the legislature does want to direct as priorities. Does it want it to be health and safety? Does it want to be projects that have job creation components? Does the legislature want to focus on things that might have liability issues? We don't have a set list of criteria that we've proposed or a set list of numbers, but we certainly think the administration has some reasonable, has articulated some reasonable priorities.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay, I don't want to belabor the point, but as I heard, though, the initial explanation was essentially we did our budgeting and this is what we felt. The word wasn't left over, but the concept was left over to direct towards infrastructure and deferred maintenance. And I guess the broader question would be, would the LAO be comfortable with that method, or should the legislature say, you know, no, we're going to take a look through the budget and we don't think this number is adequate, for example, and we're going to find other places to pull some money? Or is the LAO comfortable with that approach, saying, take the leftover and put it here?
I think ultimately, once again, it's a policy call for the legislature how much it wants to dedicate towards deferred maintenance versus other one-time spending proposals this year. One approach is to kind of build the budget that way. I think certainly you can build it a variety of different ways, but I think ultimately it's a policy call.
Mr. Chair, members, Brian Brown with the LAO. I just want to add on to what Mrs. Kirstein said, which is to, I think part of our point is that with each one of these departments that is receiving some funding for deferred maintenance, you probably do want to look at that individual department and try to identify what their needs are, what their drivers of maintenance problems and deferred maintenance is. And that story might be a little bit different for every department. And so that in setting your we would agree that you do want to set your priorities and decide what level of funding is that you're comfortable with. And that should be driven by those kinds of questions, what the needs are, what the drivers of needs are, and what kind of facilities and priorities what kind of priorities you have for your facilities. And that could end up being more funding than what's proposed or less, but ultimately it is a policy call.
Well, then that leads me to a broader question, I suppose. If we're supposed to look and make these individual policy calls, you know, what is the need for the schools, and what is the need for transportation, and what is the need for the hospitals, shouldn't the budget subcommittees that handle those particular areas be delving into this at a more detailed level, because that's what they're charged with, as opposed to us at this kind of 30,000 foot level? Isn't this more appropriate in other subcommittees in more detail?
I'd respond and say both. You know, Caltrans is not the particular responsibility of this subcommittee. Nevertheless, ultimately, when we vote on the budget, it's a big part of the budget that we evaluate and vote on. So, you know, I think both is necessary and appropriate. You know, as much detail as the committees would like to go into, I think is a good idea.
Well, is there a plan for the transportation subcommittee to deal with the transportation aspect of the infrastructure plan?
That would be a question for them. I mean, you know.
Well, it's a question maybe for the panel. Maybe you've heard, or maybe those subcommittees intend to duck the issue and leave it to us.
Brian may be more familiar with the schedule than me, but I think the subcommittees are really getting going, and I know there's a full schedule for the transportation. I don't know the agendas, haven't reviewed them myself, but I would assume that this would be a topic.
You're not scheduled to testify.
I'm not personally, but I have some people back here that are.
I think with the state budget being in better shape and the availability of one-time monies, so-called one-time money, certainly that's what has stimulated me to delve into it more deeply, not just in the traditional areas of sub-4, but the bigger 30,000-foot evaluation of all the state's infrastructure responsibilities, because ultimately, as I said, we'll be voting on the budget, and you know, committee chairs in the Assembly and the Senate rotate. And so I think the more knowledge, just speaking for myself, the more knowledge I have about all the infrastructure programs the state has and the general topic of deferred maintenance, I'm being, judges in Orange County are asking me about capital and maintenance needs for the Orange County courts. Now, it's not in the specific jurisdiction of Sub 4. Nevertheless, it matters to me a lot, and I want to be able to be knowledgeable in those areas. So, as I said, I think the answer is both, Mr. Wagner, and in terms of infrastructure. Other questions? Questions for Finance or LAO? Mr. Mullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for the presentation. I know this is not the Transportation Subcommittee, but it is a particular area of interest of mine, having served on the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the Bay Area. I'm glad to see that 94% is heading for transportation in terms of this investment. But on the deferred maintenance question, $65 billion is a sobering figure. $815 million is a nice start, but it's just a fraction. There was some comparison to the state of New York and some of the debt levels. How does California stack up just in terms of our deferred maintenance? I know on a dollar figure we've got to be at the top. But how do we, I just need some context here on how severe this deferred maintenance issue is in relation to the other 49 states. Do we know on a per capita basis how bad this problem is?
I'm not aware of any information that I've come across that where each state would identify its deferred maintenance need. But that's something we could look into and see if that information exists.
Yeah, this is definitely an area we don't want to be number one, but I have a suspicion we may be close. Second question, just on the general investment in transportation. I mean, I think we can all agree that this is an area that's woefully underfunded. Too much an over-reliance, I think, on bond and debt and not enough pay-as-you-go. Ms. Bosley mentioned the rainy day fund prospect of maybe moving some money in that direction. I am interested in some more details on that proposal. But that's really an allocation, a reallocation of some sort, as opposed to additional revenue streams to fund this woefully underfunded area of government responsibility, largely. Is there a global fix that's been contemplated in terms of additional revenue stream to begin to address, and I'm talking about public transportation as well, just looking at the Bay Area's needs. It just seems to me that we're not really having a conversation to the scale of the problem. Beyond the rainy day fund idea, are there any other options out there? And I know you get into state-local mix, and it's a cobbling together of funds, but I just don't think we're adequately dealing with what is probably bordering on something of a crisis when you look at the levels of deferred maintenance and other issues.
So the governor is not proposing any additional or new taxes at all, as you're suggesting. I think there are initiatives out there that are circulating that may have may make it to the ballot or may not that do that, but we're not proposing anything in that area. I think what we're proposing is really, a step back. And not dedicating additional monies to new ongoing expenditures because of the very reason that you're concerned about, that we do have many debts on our books, and deferred maintenance is just one of them. We have pension obligations. We have bonds that have already been authorized but unissued. So there's a significant amount that we have on our plate already to fund with our existing tax base. I think that the rainy day fund that the governor has proposed is really to help manage through what we have are very volatile revenue sources, especially capital gains. And the history has shown that it's very difficult to manage through those peaks and valleys. And so I think the reserve is really all about setting the state up to have a more stable future so that we can, like we are this year, start chipping away at what are very serious maintenance issues and infrastructure issues. So that's really, I think, our approach, the governor's approach in this budget, as opposed to going after additional revenue sources at this time.
I have one last question, which is in the area of the deferred maintenance for community college system. The proposal is for $175 million to that system, with a portion of the funds to go toward instructional materials. And it's back to my definition question, is how is deferred maintenance defined? And you said there's really no cap in terms of the spending, but there are definitions in terms of necessity. And that one just struck me as odd.
Yeah.
And if you don't have an answer today, maybe you could get back to us on that one.
I probably will get back to you, but I think what
It's a pretty broad
what we're
definition.
dealing with is a little bit more of a historical convention. I think that is a categorical that we have provided one-time monies to community colleges for in the past, and so instructional materials
Pretty broad definition.
is one thing that one-time monies are often spent on. So there's a whole array of investments that are being made out of that categorical historically. So,
all right. Well, yeah, more information on that one would be very helpful and appreciated. Thank you. Any other questions for the good of the order? Mr. Nazarian, you've been quiet? Okay. Just listening and absorbing. All right. Thank you very much to the Finance Department folks and the LAO. Very, very nicely done. Good, solid information. And thanks to Genevieve. Anything else for the order? We do need to invite public comments, and I want to point out that we did receive a letter from the California Association of Counties commenting on the 5-year plan. Any public comments this afternoon? Go ahead and state your name and organization. You can sit or you can stand, either way. Either way. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Kiana Best with the California State Association of Counties. We did submit a letter this morning. Apologize for the lateness, so I thought I would take a brief moment to provide some of those comments in the letter. I would just thank the committee for this opportunity to review the governor's 5-year infrastructure plan and to provide public comment. We agree with many of the comments made by the panelists today. I think this report serves as an important tool to the legislature, the administration, and stakeholders as we decide how and when to sort of tackle the tremendous infrastructure needs across a broad category of issues ranging from transportation, water, to education. And I recognize that the report cannot take on every aspect of infrastructure facing the state, but I do want to take this opportunity to emphasize the integrated nature of one aspect of the report, and that's transportation, as Assemblymember Mullen just mentioned in his comments. CSAC, cities and counties are facing a pretty tremendous maintenance need on the local street and road system. Our last report in 2012 identified $82 billion in maintenance and preservation needs, and that's just for the local system. Californians rely on a seamless, safe, multimodal, efficient transportation system, and quite frankly, they want to be able to get to work, school, and to the grocery store regardless of who owns the system. They want to be able to do that safe and efficiently. And so I'm here to offer our help as we continue to look at the infrastructure needs, and we want to make sure that we are a proactive partner with the legislature and the state as we sort of debate how to take, I guess, the first bite of the apple here. So with that, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Christina Tokes. I'm the Director of Facilities and Planning at the Los Angeles Unified School District. I just wanted to provide a perspective from our K-12 schools. The Los Angeles Unified School District has undertaken a need assessments and a master plan of our 900-plus campuses. We have over 14,000 school buildings. The average building is approximately 50 years old. 23% of our classrooms are in portables. The average age of those portables is 40 years. It should be about 25. We identified $60 billion of unmet capital needs. At the local level, we are doing our best to make sure our students are in clean, safe, and adequate facilities. However, we cannot do this alone. The state is equally responsible for the condition of our students' facilities and must ensure equitable housing for all of our state students. The state and local school districts have had a successful partnership in the past decade, and the state must continue to partner moving forward in order to ensure that all of the students in California will be able to have adequate school facilities. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Appreciate that. Any other members of the public wishing to comment? If not, that concludes public comments. Committee, I'd like to suggest that we ask the Department of Finance to report back to us by May 1st in time for the May revise on with a list of shovel-ready projects. I'm imagining they have the beginnings of such a list already, and this should give them enough time to compile a helpful list so that we can look at it to the extent that funds may be available. And again, shovel-ready should be defined as it was discussed here earlier. Whether it's capital or deferred maintenance projects that are ready to go. So that would be very helpful, and we will appreciate that. Do we need a motion for something like that? Okay, good, good. Mr. Nazarian, did you have anything else?
I just wanted to take a minute and wish Genevieve a happy birthday. She's the cog that makes this committee work, so thank you and happy birthday.
All right, happy birthday, Genevieve. All right. Thank you very much. A good hearing, and we'll look forward to our next one here in a couple of weeks. Thank you. The hearing's next week, excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Wagner.